everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Future of Data Security. Today I'm speaking with Omar Khawaja, Field CISO at Databricks. Omar, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me, John.
We were talking earlier, and you said inertia is the greatest enemy of progress in security program. I'm curious what you mean by that, and what's the most dangerous form of inertia you see CISOs falling into today?
Yeah, when I look at the things that we need to get done, and on the one hand, it can be tempting to think about there's the attackers, the opportunistic kind, or the nation state kind, and it's them. The reality is, so many of the challenges that we have are internal to our organizations. It's difficulty getting people moving in the direction we want them to move. Sometimes it's our own teams within security. Sometimes it's our partner teams in technology, increasingly teams on the data side, on the business side, on the legal side. And if as CISOs, we were able to somehow perfectly manufacture alignment and momentum, our jobs would be much, much easier. And so, the reason I sort of call out inertia is just as a reminder to us to not be mistaken that if I get the right technology and I get the right budget, that magically things will work. Because as a newer CISO, that was my instinct, and it took me a few years to realize that it was very difficult to build a program successfully just because I had the right technology and just because I had the right budget. And ultimately, what I ended up with is if I can figure out a way to get people moving and influence them to engage in the right behaviors, then running a security program successfully becomes easier. So I sort of honed in on that at the ultimate root cause of what prevents us from running uber successful security programs.
So, in other words, when you say inertia, you're kind of talking about the status quo or the force of habit that people have already.
Yes, yes, spot on. I remember reading this. They said it's so easy for us to continue to default. And if the option is continue to default or do something different, the human sort of condition is one that we would rather do the default. So anytime we can make the decision very explicit, so instead of it feeling like I'm going to continue to go on this highway and taking an exit requires more work and more effort than going straight. This behavioral psychologist talked about this idea of how do you introduce T-junctions more often? So you're coming up on a dead end and just, you can't keep going the way you're going. You have to make a very explicit and deliberate decision to say where to next.
And I really like that T-junction analogy. It's even more brutal than, a fork. It's literally binary choice.
Yeah, make a decision. And this is true for so many of our lives. They just sort of take this natural progression. If you look at our closets, if we look at our desks, physical ones, if we look at our virtual desktops, over time we end up amassing a lot of things and a lot of clutter. And when we try to make the decision of what do we need and what do we not need, it's very easy to make the decision to add stuff. It's very difficult to make the decision to remove stuff. But the reality is, at some point in the journey and the maturity of a security program, the best way to make the program better is not by adding more controls, but it's by removing controls that are serving as distractions from focusing on the things that are higher priorities.
It's very interesting. I meet many CISOs and professionals, and they always end up being philosophers on psychology and how to ultimately manage people and change management. We were talking about the fact earlier that you believe people are obviously security's greatest asset on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're also often the biggest risk. Can you speak a little bit about this duality, and especially in this AI super cycle, how do you turn humans into your strongest defense?
Yeah. John, when we think about people, we have programs that focus on people and we call them things like security awareness training. And so what we are implying is that these people are not smart enough and they need to be educated. Or worse yet, we have a program called Insider Threat, where we are literally declaring that the people in our organization, or at least some subset of them, are being characterized as a threat. And so typically as security organizations, we place people on the liability side of the security and risk balance sheet. And not that that's not true, it's just it's not very useful. So if we declare that people are the problem and that people are a threat, then we are less likely to think about the opportunity we have in working with the people and working with them positively. In my last role, we had over 80,000 people in the organization. So if I assumed as a true paranoid security person that any one of them could cause an incident today, then my framing is going to be to build a fortress and to protect against those people. However, those people have access to my systems, access to my data, the ability to make decisions, the ability to send and share data and give other people access to the data. And so if I frame it as these 80,000 people can somehow be assets, and somehow these 80 people can turn towards making a positive impact, and I move them to the asset side of the security and risk balance sheet, all of a sudden, lots of opportunities open up. And so I don't talk about security awareness. I then think about security behavior. I don't think of these people as threats. I can think of them as champions. I can think of them as change agents. I can think of them as ambassadors to drive that culture of information protection that we need, because the security team is typically a very tiny subset of the entire enterprise, 1%, maybe even less in most cases. There's no way we're going to be in every conversation, in every meeting, in every room, in every project. However, those 80,000 people are going to be there. And so if we can do things to treat them as being partners and being assets, they will do amazing things. So, a small example, we shifted the way that we did security awareness and we made it all about human risk management and driving behavior. And when we did that, we changed the approach. We went from people hating to take training to, in a typical year, we would have 10,000 people take optional training because they wanted to.
That's very interesting what you're saying, that really we're making this a we thing. We're all in the same team. We all have the same mission when it comes to the security of the organization. But you're right, it's often a very threatening, us against them type of activity. And it starts with the nomenclature, insider threats, things like that. It's so true. I'm curious, as you worked in different organizations, obviously smaller organizations, bigger ones, what's the difference between securing a startup and a, $30 billion enterprise in terms of actual security outcomes?
On the one hand, securing a startup that doesn't have nearly as complex and large a surface area likely doesn't have much tech debt, likely doesn't have much legacy. Although, when I work with startups, even startups talk about technical debt. It's this their technical debt is 5 or 6 years old, versus in healthcare, you know, my last organization, we literally had a hospital that was 150 years old. And so you think about legacy and you think about tech debt, it's relative. So, on the one hand, a startup is going to be simpler than a larger organization, a $30 billion organization. But on the other hand, neither is going to be easy. On the larger organization is going to care more about resilience, going to care more about longevity, going to care more likely about their reputation because it took them many, many decades to build that reputation. The startup isn't going to be nearly as worried about reputation. And so in the startup, you may have more of an uphill battle to convince the founding team that security is important because they haven't had an incident. They probably don't have very large customers requiring significant expectations of them from a control perspective, third-party assurances for security. And so each have their challenges. Of course, in the larger organization, the challenges of scale and how do you operate within the bureaucracy and so many teams, and things are likely not going to be nearly as centralized as a CISO would want them to be. In a startup, the challenge is going to be, I don't have enough people. Everybody is at capacity. There's 2 or 3 people on the security team. That's a very big team for a typical startup. And each of those people are wearing multiple hats. And so how do you get them to be experts at different things? So much of it then comes down to the ability to prioritize, the ability to understand what the organization's risk tolerance is. In a startup, chances are the risk tolerance is high. As the CISO, as a security professional, my biggest challenge is to not impose my risk tolerance on the organization that I'm working in, but to understand and really learn what the risk tolerances of the organization and then build a security program to mirror it. You know, in a startup, it may be perfectly fine to have a much longer list of latent high and critical vulnerabilities in the infrastructure than a CISO would want. The CISO would look at them and likely their blood pressure would go up when they see the list of critical vulnerabilities, but it's not their blood pressure that matters. You have to understand what the organization's blood pressure looks like.
It's very interesting that you've worked in this continuum of organizations and to watch them grow and see priorities and attitude shift. If we stick a little bit on the top end of that, you've worked with large companies at a global scale, some of them operating in multiple countries. What's the biggest challenge you see there in implementing security, data security, data privacy worldwide with different attitudes and culture in the mix?
Yeah, I think, this weekend I spent some time with the CEO of a startup working on helping him, guiding him on their challenges. They were very excited because they got their SOC 2. For a startup, that's a very big deal. For a large organization, getting a SOC 2 is something, they probably did 10 years ago, so not as big a deal in 2025. Last week, I happened to be in Sao Paulo meeting with many, many organizations. What I heard from them is similar to what I hear from other large organizations is how do I know when I have enough security? And how do I know whether I leave the security decisions at the individual business unit and geo level versus do I centralize it? And organizations are ping ponging between we want to decentralize, each business unit gets its own CISO with a very light dotted line to a central group CISO, and organizations that are centralized think that decentralized makes more sense, and organizations that are decentralized think centralized makes more sense. It's sort of the grass is greener on the other side. And the thing that, you know, I share with these organizations is it's very, very important to understand and build alignment with the leadership team and figuring out what is that risk tolerant at the business unit level, because every business unit is going to have a different risk tolerance and it will change based on the competitive conditions, the macroeconomic conditions, the maturity of the organization, the maturity of the leadership team. But key is to align there and have some way to check your math. So just because the CEO of a business unit says, I have high risk tolerance, you can't leave it at that. Just like in math, if you want to do the problem really well, you have to get to the answer, and then you have to find a way to double check that that's the right answer by getting to it from a totally different way. And if you can get to the same answer in two different ways, then you're onto something, because risk tolerance is a really, really big decision, and risk appetite is a big decision to make, and you want to get it right. And one of the things that happens often is business unit leaders will say, well, you're treating this team unfairly compared to how you're treating this other team. And why do you have different expectations? And the example I use is of children. When you become a parent of one child, you think it's very hard until you have a second child. And you think, wait, I will just repeat what I did the first time. And by the time you have your third child, you realize that there is no copy paste. Every child is different. And the longer you try to copy paste and fail, the more frustrated you will be as a parent. The sooner you realize and accept the level of complexity that you've gotten into by having three children or more, is that everyone is different. So when you treat them fairly, that doesn't mean you treat them equally. That means you understand what their needs are and you treat them accordingly. That's the same thing from a business unit perspective, and it is incredibly difficult for large organizations to do.
Very interesting. I could see how, nerds and technical people are trying to find the cookie cutter approach to raising kids, but never works. You're right.
It doesn't work. So
Let's talk about something nobody cares about. Nobody's thinking about AI, data, the super cycle. I'm curious what you're seeing specifically from a security perspective. What are some of the emerging risks out there that you could share with the audience, and where should people really think this is going over the next 18, 24 months?
Yeah, when AI first came to the fore, I spent over 20 years in cyber, but I didn't know how to do risk analysis on AI. You could give me, cloud, you could give me a partnership, you could give me M&A, you could give me expansion, you could give me any business or technical context, and I could do a risk analysis as we're speaking and you're describing the context. But when it came to AI, I just I didn't have the instinct, and all there was in my mind was mush and fog. And so what was important is to lift that fog and be methodical about it. And the first part of it, John, was to define what it is. So we first said, what is AI? And we said it's these 12 components. Okay, now we know what it is. Now can we define what are the things that can go wrong with it? And we realized there's so many different use cases for AI that every use case may have different risks associated with it. If you have a use case that's intended to write jokes and make people laugh, that use case is very different risks than one where you decide, I'm going to fine tune my own model and use it to determine when I'm doing laparoscopic knee surgery exactly where I should make the incision, right? Very different risks, even though both may actually look like a chatbot providing responses to an individual. And so we said we have to define what all the things are that can go wrong. And this is where we sort of modeled it over in the world of psychology and psychiatry. They have something called the DSM. And so there's many different conditions that can happen with the human brain and our mental health. And so we said, okay, that's called the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual. I think it's up to version 5 now. And we said, can we create a version of that? Like all the things that can go wrong. So instead of saying that person is crazy, can we actually give that condition a name? Because the moment we give it a name, we actually have some hope that maybe we can do something about it. And so we ended up creating and enumerating a list of 62 risks associated with AI. We don't think it's a complete and exhaustive list, but we think it's a really, really good place to start. And then we made it public and called it the Databricks AI Security Framework. And for each of the risks, we actually identify what are the interventions, what are the controls that you can implement to manage those risks. So for us, what was important is really to give enterprises a framework within which to operate, appreciating and acknowledging and incorporating the level of complexity that a typical enterprise goes through when it comes to an AI use case. We did not want to boil it down to here's the top five. And the analogy I use, because I would get asked almost weekly and still do, what are the top five risks of AI? And so we put a list together, and I felt really, really bad about putting this list together and talking about it. And people would ask me, what's wrong with this list? Why isn't this top five work? And the best metaphor I could come up with is, John, where do you live?
I live in Toronto.
You live in Toronto, right? So imagine if we said, can you put a top five list together of the temperature in Canada? You could do it. You could pick, the average of all of the country, all of the cities in Canada and say the top five temperatures today are 37 degrees, 39 degrees, and 23 degrees. That would be a mathematically and scientifically accurate list based on real data and that you could actually show. However, from a utility perspective, not very useful because the only place that you care about temperature is in Toronto and you care about it for today or you care about it for tomorrow. And so this idea, same thing with AI, is we could tell you what's happening in the zeitgeist, but what you really want to know is tell me what I should care about for my use case.
Very interesting. First, a good Canadian would say it's cold, 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 cold. That's the temperatures.
Okay, you're right. Maybe that's a bad example. Maybe in that case, that would be useful, the top five.
I've been looking myself at the kind of top five, top three. Some of the prime risks that I hear clients and partners talk about all the times are related to chatbots like data loss through prompt, file upload. And another one I see is a lot of systems are evolving just beyond standard RAG. Now we're talking about agents with continuous unfettered access to data sources. And people have been thinking about oh my God, this OneDrive has a lot of data that nobody cared about before. Are you at least aligning with me on that notion that there's definitely a lot of concerns about the surface level chatbots and these types of risks? What's your thoughts?
I mean, John, those are spot on. We hear about those very, very often, and those are ones to be addressed. We break up the AI system into four subsystems. There's the world of data operations, the world of model operations, and then sort of the DevSecOps piece of the serving layer, how you serve it through some kind of application API. And then you have some kind of unified governance that runs across all of them. The most number of risks that we've identified are on the far left, which is in the data layer. So where I'm collecting the raw data, I'm preparing the data, I'm featureizing things, and then using that for my models. So a lot of that would be around access and access governance and being able to understand your data and catalog it and organize it appropriately. And then on the other side is the serving layer. How are you serving this? And particularly as we move into agentic, the serving layer isn't just connecting to an end user submitting an inference request and an inference response coming out. It's become much more complicated with chain of thought and reasoning agents that are then quarterbacking multiple tasks that are connecting via MCP or perhaps other protocols to multiple other deterministic, in some cases, probabilistic systems as well. So, sort of understanding what the surface area looks like, what is the architecture, all the places that there's connectivity, and being able to threat model that and identify, pinpoint the risks that matter. And then, of course, mitigating those risks, that's key. So, in the version 2 of DASF, we have 62 risks. We're about to release a double click into DASF that just focuses on the agentic risks. And we're also going to speak very specifically of what does it mean to be an agent. And so far, I think we've identified 4 components that make up an agent. And then for each of those components, what are the specific risks to be thinking about?
That's very interesting because, people can't even agree on definitions nowadays. What is an agent is indeed
Yeah.
a good question.
What we find is, and I was in a conversation with a panel a few months ago, and someone from a very prominent industry body was on there. And one of the things they said is we don't have a clear definition of AI. We don't have a clear definition of what the risks are. And I'm just shaking my head and I'm saying that's not true. We do have a clear definition of both. Now, as security people, we tend to focus on the 1%. So I could show you something that's 99% there, but we'll say, well, you're missing the 1%. Like, that's fine. The goal is not perfection. The goal is not exhaustion. The goal is to be much better than where we are today. And if we're making things better, that's progress and that's what we should focus on. And so, starting with that clear definition, we were told by our customers, we've got 15,000 customers, every single one of them is working on AI and on that journey. And they said, we want you to be opinionated. Just tell us how it works. And we said, okay, the only way we're going to be able to do that is we have to do a lot of research. We have to do a lot of peer review. So multiple rounds of peer review and, talking about 30, 40 industry experts for version 1 of DASF, for version 2 of DASF, globally from tech companies, from healthcare, from financial services, from regulators, from industry bodies, bringing all that together to say, this is what we collectively believe is the definition of AI. This is what we believe are the risks. These are what we believe are the controls and how to map them and how to actually deploy the controls for those that may be on the Databricks platform. That sort of is what enterprises have been very, very thirsty for. In fact, yesterday I was talking to 3 executives from a very prominent telco in Canada, and this is exactly the conversation with them is, we've got this AI opco, we're trying to do AI, but most of the people that are in the opco don't have a decade of experience with AI. They're figuring it out. How do we accelerate that? Because when we have decades of experience in something, we've got the instincts, things go fast. We don't have time to get decades of experience in AI to get good at it. And so we've been trying to figure out what are the gaps that need to be filled so the dots can be connected, the synapses can start firing, the instincts start to work for AI, and people can be awesome at their jobs.
Omar, it's already started. There's CVs out there or job posting asking for 15 years of AI experience.
Yeah. It's which is nuts. I happen to have someone on my team that started doing AI in 2003. So there's very, very few. I mean, machine learning and classic ML, of course, this is all very pre Gen AI and transformers, but those people are very, very few and far, far between.
Right. The good old days of genetic algorithms and all these olden techniques. Talking about this synapse firing, I think one of the superpower of AI is its versatility, and there's no shortage of new ideas and use cases. I'd love to hear what you think are the most overhyped security AI ideas right now, and what are the real ones that you see are really helping CISOs and helping security teams leveraging AI.
Yeah, the overhyped ones, I think of the shiny object syndrome. Almost always when someone is starting with, I want to use this AI. I want to use this technology. I want to use this technology. And they're more excited about the technology than they are about the outcome. And they may not even have defined the outcome. That's a clear signal that this is hype. It's not going to go anywhere. And many organizations took that approach. I actually have been fortunate. I get to spend quite a bit of time with board directors over the last year and a half, and through NACD and the Diligent Institute, doing some teaching and webinars and one-on-ones with them. And one of the things I say to them is, please stop telling management they need an AI strategy. Because when you say you need an AI strategy, what you are inadvertently encouraging is shiny object syndrome, right? The goal then becomes, we want to do AI. Now let's figure out where we can do AI, versus the goal should be the mission of the organization. You should have a strategy. You should be thinking in the context of your company strategy, how is AI going to do something? Is it going to accelerate your strategy? Is it going to de-risk your strategy? Is it going to enable it to be delivered with lower cost? Is it going to allow you to expand the scope of your strategy? But there's got to be some verb that you're using that actuates your strategy in some way. And so you're being very clear, AI is a tool. AI is not the goal. Now, if you happen to be a company like Databricks, we announced yesterday we've surpassed $1 billion in revenue in AI. AI is our strategy because we are a data and AI company. But if you're not a data and AI company, you should not have an AI strategy. You should just have a business strategy that you enable and accelerate and actuate using AI. Those are the classes of use cases which feel way overhyped. The other maybe corollary I'll add to that, John, is cases where you're sort of thinking of AI as a magic wand. This is a big problem. I can't hire the right people. These people aren't doing a good job. You know what? I'll bring AI and I will wave the magic wand, and somehow the problem will go away. So if you don't understand the problem, you don't have sufficient data, your data is not organized, it's not curated, you can't featureize it, you're going to have a difficult time using AI to magically solve that problem. On the other hand, there are problems and challenges which clearly can be enhanced in their resolution using AI, and that's where inertia comes into play, and we're not able to be successful at it. Our CEO shared a story with us recently. He was talking to the CFO of one of the largest banks on the planet, and the CFO had said, "I would love for my team to spend less time in Excel." Right. Why are we in Excel? Why are we in Google Sheets? Because spreadsheets are very familiar to us. We've spent 10, 15, 20, 25 years in spreadsheets. We know how they work. We feel comfortable, and we love the simplicity of the rows and the columns and our formulas that we're used to. If you've got more than 50 or 100 rows and more than 5 or 6 columns in your Excel spreadsheet, there's a good chance that AI could help you speed up the analysis. So you're asking, we want to be experts at asking the questions, and let AI help us get the answers. We don't want to spend all the time just looking for the answers. We want to be experts on the business. We want to be experts on the outcomes. Those are areas where enabling AI and implementing AI can be huge, and inertia is what often gets in the way there.
Yeah, this is a very good way to close the loop on inertia. I'm gonna put a magic wand on my desk now so I can pull it out whenever I'm speaking to someone that has magical thinking. Omar, if you could go back, and give yourself, a younger self, a piece of advice that would save you a lot of grief or lessons learned over the years, what would that be?
I would say I would say something about embrace the struggle. When things are hard, focus on how to resolve, how to reconcile, but don't be so concerned that there's a hard problem or there's a challenge. Sort of reduce your stress level, take a few deep breaths, take a 5 or 10 minute walk out in nature, come back to it, and know that particularly if you're in a leadership role, that's kind of what you're there for. If things are easy, they probably don't need a leader over that area. If things don't need to change, the goal of the leader quite literally is to lead a team, an organization, a group somewhere. So if you don't have to go anywhere and the status quo is perfectly fine, you don't need a leader. And so this idea of driving change, influence, having struggle, having hard problems, that is absolutely par for the course. And that isn't something in and of itself that is something to be feared or to get away from. You have to drive towards those hard problems and work through them.
Fantastic piece of advice, Omar. Unfortunately, that's all the time we're going to have to cover for today. Before we wrap up, if people want to follow along your work or some of the great publications you mentioned on AI risk, where's the best place for them to go?
Two things. One is you can follow me on LinkedIn. The other is if you're interested in, the two frameworks that we've published over the last year and a half. One is the Databricks AI Security Framework. The other is the Databricks AI Governance Framework. One more focused on technical risk, the other more focused on the larger governance and execution of AI. Go to your favorite search engine and type in DASF or Databricks AI Governance Framework, and you can find those. Download them. Those are free and open to everyone, even non-Databricks customers. And we want to contribute to the larger industry, help people leverage and execute AI and do it safely and responsibly.
Fantastic. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for your insight and thanks again for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, John. My pleasure.